everybody at oh, thank you everybody at AKA for inviting me in to share my story. I really appreciate it. Um, I also want to do a little disclaimer. My internet connection's a little spotty, so I might be a little stagnant visually, but hopefully the sound is coming through. So I apologize for the tech issues there. Okay, so I was really excited to learn that in the month of September, the theme for AKA is learning, education, and growth in spirit of back to school. I have two kids. They just went back to school last week, so I'm like really in the back to school zone. I also teach in higher education. I teach in a Master's of Arts in Teaching program. So I am teaching teachers, pre-service teachers every day. So I am swimming in the world of back to school. And I wanted to give a little context to my adoption experience. I am adopted, but I want to situate it in this world of education, because that's the theme, and I love the theme. So to kind of backtrack a little bit, before I went down this rabbit hole of researching for this book, and looking at myself as an adopted person, before that journey happened, I was working on my doctorate as an education historian, and I was focusing on the subject area of resistance, student resistance to assimilation education. And I want to give some context and kind of tie that to the book. So what that means is when I was working on my doctorate in education history between 2014 and 2017, my historical research was on off-reservation Indian boarding schools in the early 1900s, and looking at the ways in which Indigenous students, most of whom were at these schools not by choice, how they were resisting the colonizing education that was enforced upon them in these schooling spaces. And to give a little context for off-reservation Indian boarding schools, if folks aren't aware of that history, they really originated with this guy named Richard Pratt, who started the first off-reservation, is there US government-funded off-reservation Indian boarding schools. The first one was founded in 1884 by Richard Pratt. It was called the Carlisle Indian School. And literally this was Richard Pratt's motto. He said, "Kill the Indian, save the man." So the goal of assimilation education in these spaces was to strip Native children of their culture, their language, their clothing, their hair, take them as far away from their homes, their families, and their ties to ancestry as possible, and transplant them in schools that aim to assimilate them into white culture, defining how they dressed, talked, read, worked. So this was the academic historical world I was swimming in my research. And then in 2017, right when I finished my doctorate, my sister died of a drug overdose, and everything in my world stopped, and all of my focus turned toward adoption. I had to do like a deep soul search and understand my adoption in order to process her death, because she too was adopted like me, and she also gave a child up for adoption. So she was an adoptee and a birth mother. And one of the very first books I picked up in my adoption journey of, what many of you know of as Coming Out of the Fog, was Susan Harness's book, Bitterroot, which is amazing. I'm sure a number of you have heard of it. And this was Susan's book, Bitterroot, was the very first memoir I ever read written by somebody who was adopted. And it just blew me away. So Susan's story, it's her story of being adopted as an Indigenous baby, taken from her home on the Confederated Salish Kootenai Tribal Reservation as a toddler, a very young toddler, and adopted out, placed into a white family far, far from the reservation. And in her incredible memoir, Harness writes extensively about the Indian Adoption Project. So I want to kind of situate that for a minute historically too. So in the mid 20th century, when adoption was becoming more and more prolific and institutionalized throughout the country, the US government created the Indian Adoption Project. And this project was a scientific experiment aimed at proving the effectiveness of assimilating indigenous youth into dominant white culture through adoption. Babies and young children were taken forcibly from their homes on reservation communities and adopted into white families, hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles away from their homes. So in reading Susan Harness's story for the first time, these two worlds of mine were sort of colliding, right? My research on assimilation education and my experience as an adoptee and my awareness of adoption. And for the first time, I understood adoption as an assimilation project. I have always been aware of the power of education, the ways that we are educated as students, as a society, to believe that certain things are good and certain things are bad, that certain people are good and certain people are bad. This is the power of education. And I had been educated to believe, like many of us have, certain things about my adoption, what it meant about me, what it meant about my family, what it meant about the woman who gave birth to me and relinquished me. And with this new framework of seeing adoption as an assimilation project, everything I had believed, been told to believe, began to crumble. And this was really the beginning of me coming out of the fog. So as a history teacher, I found relief in history to make sense of, one, this fog that I had been living in about adoption, and then two, the reality of adoption and the real experiences of millions of adoptees around the world. In my chapter on the international adoption industry in the book, I write about the history of the international adoption market, and I connect to the US involvement in the Korean War and the war in Vietnam. And I write, in 1975, 2 months after Operation Baby Lift, in which thousands of babies and children were airlifted out of Saigon and flown to Europe, Canada, Australia, and the majority to the United States to be adopted out, I was born into a nation desperate to heal from the Vietnam War. And adoption was seen as a method of healing. But who was being saved through these adoptions? The babies, the parents, the nation. All of these distinctions were blurred. And I think one of the greatest things education can provide for us is the capacity to critically question what we think, what we've been told, and what we think we know as true. And that has been the real driving force of this book, is to reframe and challenge people to think, question, and think about what they know or what they've been told about adoption. And I just want to end by reading one of my favorite passages from the book that I think kind of distills both my love of history, the power of history, and just this call of this educational call of thinking critically about the way we view the world and the way we view these issues like adoption. In her memoir detailing her search for her birth family, Katrina Maxstone Graham describes adoption as, quote, an amputation from history. To heal the wound of this amputation, the silence and the lives that defined our lives, I had to reach out to those historical roots and threads and reattach them. History, the true stories of the past, became my way of speaking truth to power for my sister Rachel, now that she had lost her voice in death. History is constantly sticking its fingers into our present everyday lives, whether or not we are aware of it. History has incredible power. It can paint pictures of where we came from and how the world and the people in it looked, acted, and believed. This is weighty because how we understand ourselves and the world around us in this current moment is largely defined and shaped by what happened in the past. This is the power of historical narratives and historical memory. When people's lives in the past are silenced, this in turn silences people's lives in the present. But when these stories are told, it changes our understanding of the present world. When people's stories are shared, especially the lives of people who were deliberately traumatized and silenced, those awoken historical narratives directly affect the lives of people in the present. When we start to view the world and our place in it differently, then we actually start to act differently. And this in turn impacts the future. History is powerful. So that's my little opening, hopefully getting some inspiration for both education and particularly history.
Wow. I'm still kind of blown away here and taking all of that in. Um, wow. So when you decided to write this book, you talked about how that was in 2020, sort of a pandemic, coming into being. What what really what got you started? I mean, you talked about that a little bit. I'd like you to elaborate. What was this a long-term ambition? Did it form very quickly? What got you going on writing this work?
So no, this was not long term. This was like, if somebody in 2017 had said, oh, Becca, you're going to write this book on adoption, I would have been like, there's no way I'm going to write a book about adoption. I'm not going to talk about adoption. I don't tell people I'm like, I don't do that. So this was like my sister's death just, you know, like I said in my opening, it kind of disintegrated everything I had thought previously. And then as I started reading, and I was reading this history of adoption and reading books like Susan Harness's Bitterroot, Nefertiti Austin, a phenomenal writer who wrote Motherhood So White. I started reading everything I could about adoption, particularly memoirs at first, and that really sort of dismantled my reality. And then like I shared in the opening, the only way I knew how to make sense of what I was reading and seeing this, so many other people who have been adopted have experienced trauma, and like I related to all these people, and I was like, oh, I'm not alone in feeling the way I feel. Why didn't I have this awareness earlier? And at the same time, I do want to share, I started to, in 2018, part of the way I was trying to sort of deal with my sister's death and deal with starting to come out of the fog was to start a search. And I went to my parents and they had no information to give me. And I was unfortunately born in the state of California in 1975, and I still do not have access to my original birth certificate. so I just was hitting all these walls. And then, like I shared my opening, I was like, well, I have nothing else to do except for I can understand the history. And so then I went down this rabbit hole of reading every historical piece of research that had been done on that I could get my hands on adoption, just to like make sense of it. Um, but yeah, that journey really did not start until after my sister died. Before that, I was, I didn't even know the term coming out of the fog, right? I was so in the fog. I was in the fog, I couldn't even see my hand in front of my face. So, yeah, it was like an abrupt
Mm,
getting yanked out of the fog
okay.
very quick.
Right. That's something I can relate to, and probably others here too. First of all, I mean, our, you know, sincerest condolences to you on the loss of your sister, Rachel. That's very painful. You know, you talk about coming out of the fog. What maybe in your writing journey, maybe did you learn the most? Maybe what was the most surprising thing that you learned?
That's so hard to answer because I learned so many shocking things. I mean, first I have been on this journey as an educator, and uh, an educator who really is passionate about anti-racist work and multicultural education. I'm constantly learning about my layers of privilege as a white, heteronormative, middle class, educated person. And I think what shocked me was just the amount of just brutality that has been targeted towards women of color, indigenous women, women who are experiencing poverty, and then compound that with fertility, right? Mothers. I mean, it's just nonstop. The policies that have targeted certain identities. And when you look at it from the lens of motherhood and fertility, it's absolutely enraging and astounding. And so I think I'd scratched the surface, but as an educator, but I didn't fully understand the impact when we're talking about women who have either been forcibly sterilized or have been forced to relinquish children, lied to. Um, it was just astounding, and that this has been going on decade after decade after decade. And then as I was finishing it, Hannah just shared before we started, she was listening to the book, which is on Audible. She was getting angry, and I was like, well, I was so angry when I was writing this book, and I was finishing it right when the Dobbs decision passed in 2022, and it was just like anger amplified by a millionfold. Because fertility, I saw, really sits at the center of all of these issues.
Mhm.
Reproductive autonomy, and then how our nation differentially values women and uses their fertility as a weapon against them. And then Dobbs passed, which was the overturning of the Roe decision of 1973, which gave women reproductive autonomy on a federal level. So all of it just all was stunning and horrifying for me. And as a historian, um, it's like I shared in that passage about the power of history. If we don't know this history, these histories, these women's experiences, if we don't know adoptees' experiences, if we don't know birth communities' experiences and what has happened to them and what is happening to them, then we're not going to change how we do things in the future. So I just was like, we got to get this. People need to know.
Okay, I got you. That's amazing. Let me ask you for a minute about the craft. What was your process of approaching the research that you did and the interviews that you conducted for the book?
Um, there, so that's a great question. And I do want to say, like, Jean, I know you're working on a book, which is fantastic. And we're at this space where a lot of people are coming out and saying, I have a story to tell. And so the more people get brave and sit in their vulnerability and say, I'm going to share my story, it's just like phenomenal. That is what is right. It's storytelling, telling your truth, telling your story, and having the world hear it and have people say, oh, that's similar to me and I'm not alone anymore. And it's so validating. So I'm really excited that you asked that question in hopes that more people will write and share their stories or tell their stories in different ways. I'm an academic, and so there's sort of a traditional way of doing academic research as a historian, and that's not how I wrote this book. Um, this book was crazy and discombobulated and totally emotional, and it started with my therapist telling me, I was doing grief therapy when my sister died, and my therapist was literally like, Becca, you got to just start writing all of your stories about you and your sister, write them down. So that's how it started. It started as like journaling.
Mhm.
And then as I, was reading other memoirs about adoption and right, my mind's blowing up and I'm getting pulled out of the fog. I was like, wait, I have to understand this. Why is this happening? Why was I in the fog? What's the fog about? Right? I was like, what's the fog about? Why was I lied to? Right? Why is this whole thing saturated in lies? And so it started with journaling my story. And then it was me reading every piece of history that I could. And I started to put them together. Like I could see an experience I had. For example, I opened with talking about the Indian Adoption Project, which just blew me away because that was the one piece of history that really connected with my academic research.
Mhm.
Um, but I started to see how, even though I'm white and I was adopted by white parents, so that in itself, there's a lot of privilege in that I could pass as
Mhm.
part of the family. And I especially looked more like my adoptive parents than my sister did. She had a harder time passing, which I think was part of a lot of her rage. But when I started to see the other sort of deep pieces of how assimilation affects you on the day to day in your home, I started to connect that history and the understanding and all the phenomenal research that has been done in that history with small things that were happening in my house, in my life. And so it kind of turned into this, weaving in and out of personal to historical to personal. And then I was really, really fortunate that I crossed paths with an acquisitions editor at the University of Oklahoma Press. And she was really interested in this story and interested in publishing it as a historical memoir. So not just the history part, but allowing the personal narrative to be in there. Um, which I'm just incredibly grateful for, because I think historical writing gets to be kind of dry sometimes. And a
Mhm.
lot of the history, like Wayne Karp is kind of the godfather who's of research on the history of adoption, and people aren't reading his stuff. He's great. No discredit to Wayne Karp. He's a phenomenal researcher, but people aren't just going to pick up his stuff and read it on a plane. Um, so that's where this history has gotten lost. And so I think the intention from the press side was well, if you weave the personal narrative in with the history, it'll make it more approachable, right? People can relate. That's all history is. It's just stories. It's stories of humans
Mhm.
struggling. It's the human struggle of living. Um, and so then I got a lot of really, really great guidance from the folks at the press who suggested that I create it in this framework where each chapter opens with personal narrative, then goes into the history, and then ends with personal narrative. And I have to give them credit for coming up with that design, right? And so they just basically said, all right, frame every chapter like that. Um, and then one thing that did happen that's pretty common in, especially in academic writing, is I had to go through peer review, the process of peer review. And that was brutal, but also really helpful because a lot of people read drafts of the book. And I got a lot of feedback. It had to go through 2 rounds of peer review. And I will say to anybody who is in the process of writing a book or crafting some narrative, as scary as it sounds, the more people you have, the more eyes you have on your work, the better, right? And be thoughtful about who you're giving your work to, right? You
Mhm.
want to give it to people who can give you really constructive feedback. And I got a lot of excellent constructive feedback from the press. And I also, my editor said, send it out to like 20 people in your community who you feel would give you some good feedback. And so I was also sending it out to friends and family and getting feedback from them. Um, and it was just getting that feedback, going back to the writing, getting that feedback, going back to the writing.
Got you. That's amazing. No, you touched on so many different threads there while you were talking. And I think one of the first and most important ones that everybody on this call can relate to is the power of writing down your own story simply for the purpose of healing, simply for the purpose of getting it down on the page and then seeing what that looks like. And then sort of rolling around in that and exploring that. So I love that piece of it. And then, you know, with your background in education and the access that you had to all the people, I love that. And that's great structure. I love the story structure. That's perfect. um,
Yeah, it worked out really well. I think it did. Yeah.
yeah, no, and that helps the reader not get lost. Um, my last question before we open it up to everybody else, and this is going to be hard. This isn't on the list.
I can handle it. I can handle
Okay,
it.
all right, we're ready. Of the one takeaway, 2 takeaways, 3 takeaways that you want people to have from reading this book, what do you really hope that the majority of people, be they a part of the constellation or outside of it, what do you hope that they learn as an educator, right?
I really, thank you, Jean. That's a great question. I really want people to hear the voices and the stories, as painful as they are, to hear the voices and the stories of people who have been traumatized in the adoption experience, right? Those voices are not in the historical narrative, right? They're not in the meta narrative. We still are living in this space where there are these like mantras, like you should be grateful, lucky you, this is, your parents are saviors, and it's a kind of like this fairy tale. And I think, and I am not an abolitionist, right? I think there are times and spaces where adoption can save a life and can be a really impactful, positive experience, which is why I shared Nefertiti Austin's story, her beautiful memoir, Motherhood So White, She's an adoptive mom, right? And her story is really, really powerful and really positive. And I also shared Nicole Chung's story, and she's written extensively about her adoption, and she just deeply, deeply loved and adored her adoptive parents who have both passed away now. So I'm not saying I don't want people to come away saying adoption is horrible, but I want people to sit in the complexity of it, to appreciate the complexity of it, and to really listen to the experiences, particularly of adoptees and of birth communities who have been traumatized through forced relinquishment.
Yeah,
That's my hope.
okay, beautiful and well said. Anything else you'd like to add before we open it up to Q&A?
No, I'm excited to hear people's questions.
All right, folks can take it away. You can either put something in the chat and we'll read it out, or just use one of the icons down. Where is it? Where you raise under reactions, you raise your hand, right? No. Is it different?